The crimson sky of Vexthar burned with colors that reminded Lyra of blood and fire. She stood at the edge of the high cliff where the wind never stopped blowing, and below her stretched the small human settlement that she had been sent to destroy. Her twin dragons, Ember and Ash, rested on the rocky ground behind her, their massive bodies heaving with slow, powerful breaths. The bronze-scaled dragon that humans would call Ember was older, wiser, and more cautious. The midnight black one called Ash was younger and more eager for adventure, though not for bloodshed. Lyra had raised both dragons since they were small enough to fit in her hands, and they understood her better than any being in the entire galaxy. For 1,000 years, the Galactic Coalition had expanded across the stars, bringing order and structure to wild worlds. Lyra had served the Coalition faithfully for 200 of those years, first as a soldier, then as an elite hunter. She had completed every mission without question, without hesitation, without mercy. Her commanders called her perfect. Her colleagues called her cold. Lyra did not care what they called her. She only cared about following orders and surviving long enough to receive her next assignment. But this assignment felt different from the very beginning. The message had come through official channels. A human colony had established itself on Vexthar, a planet that the Coalition had designated as uninhabitable and strictly off-limits to settlement. The humans had somehow survived here for 3 generations, building structures, growing food, and raising children in a place where the atmosphere was barely breathable and the temperature could drop to lethal levels within hours. This should have been impossible. Humans were supposed to be fragile creatures, dependent on technology and comfort to survive. Yet these humans had thrived through determination, intelligence, and what Lyra had read described as stubbornness. The Coalition could not allow this. If humans proved they could establish permanent colonies on restricted worlds, other species would follow. The balance of power that the Coalition had so carefully maintained for centuries would collapse. Order would give way to chaos, and so the decision was made. Eliminate the colony. Eliminate the humans. Return Vexthar to its designated status as an uninhabitable waste. Lyra had been chosen for this task because she had never failed, and because she had no emotional attachments to anything or anyone. The elven warrior was perfect for genocide because she felt nothing. Except today, she felt something. Ember shifted beside her, and his ancient eyes looked up at her face. The dragon's scales caught the crimson light and they burned like rubies. Lyra reached down and placed her hand on the warm, smooth surface of his neck. The dragon leaned into her touch, a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing over the long centuries of their companionship. The settlement below was preparing for evening. Lyra could see humans moving between the buildings carrying supplies, tending to what appeared to be agricultural areas. Children played in a central plaza, and their laughter carried up the cliff on the harsh wind. That sound made something uncomfortable twist in Lyra's chest. In her 200 years of existence, she had learned to suppress such feelings, to lock them away in the deepest part of her mind where they could not interfere with duty. But today the feeling would not be suppressed. A woman emerged from the largest building, and even from this distance Lyra recognized her as someone important. She moved with confidence and purpose, and others deferred to her as she walked. The woman had red hair that fell to her shoulders, and she wore practical clothing designed for survival rather than appearance. When she looked up toward the cliff, Lyra wondered if she could somehow sense the presence of the hunter who had come to destroy everything she had built. The woman's name was Grace, according to the briefing documents that Lyra had reviewed. She was the colony leader, the one who had convinced these humans to leave their overcrowded homeworlds and take the impossible risk of settling on an unforgiving planet. By all accounts, she was intelligent, compassionate, and completely committed to the survival of her people. She was also, according to her file, a mother to a child who was approximately 7 years old. Lyra had not thought much about parents or children before. Elves did not reproduce quickly, and her own childhood had been spent in military training facilities, separated from her mother almost immediately after birth. It was the way of the Coalition. Emotional bonds were weaknesses that could compromise mission performance. Children were raised by machines and instructors, not by parents. Yet watching this human woman move through her settlement with clear love for the people around her, Lyra found herself wondering what it would have been like to have a mother who cared about her individual survival, rather than her usefulness to the military machine. Ash nudged her other side, and the younger dragon made a small sound that expressed concern. The dragons had become sensitive to her emotional state over the years. They knew when something was wrong, when her carefully controlled mask was beginning to crack. Lyra turned away from the vista of the settlement and looked out toward the vast emptiness of Vexthar's barren landscape. The planet was hostile in almost every way that mattered. The soil was toxic. The water was acidic. The storms that periodically swept across the surface could strip the flesh from bone, and yet the humans had adapted, had learned, had survived. They had turned this hell into home through sheer force of will and determination. The coalition message had been clear. Destroy the colony at dawn, make it quick and efficient. Use minimal resources. Return to base by the end of the solar cycle. There would be no investigation, no questions asked. This was standard procedure for dealing with unauthorized settlements. Standard procedure. Lyra had followed standard procedure her entire adult life. Standard procedure had made her the most decorated hunter in the coalition military. Standard procedure had made her the perfect soldier. But what if standard procedure was wrong? The thought was dangerous. The thought was treasonous. Lyra had been taught that questioning orders was worse than death, worse than failure, worse than anything that could happen to a soldier. And yet the thought would not leave her mind. She watched as the sun began to set over Vexthar, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and violent purple. The humans below lit torches and fires as darkness approached. Lyra could see families gathering together, sharing evening meals. The warmth of the colony's light stood in sharp contrast to the cold and hostile darkness of the planet surrounding it. For 200 years, Lyra had been the perfect instrument of the coalition's will. She had done what was asked without question or hesitation. But in this moment, standing on a cliff above a settlement of humans who had accomplished the impossible, she began to understand that perfection and morality might not be the same thing. Ember made a low sound, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. The dragon was restless, anxious, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Ash moved closer to Lyra, his smaller but still massive frame a comforting presence against her leg. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky as Vexthar continued its slow rotation. Somewhere in the vastness of space beyond this hostile world, the Galactic Coalition watched and waited for her report. They expected her to confirm that the colony had been destroyed. They expected her to provide data and evidence of the successful completion of her mission. They expected her to be the perfect soldier, the perfect hunter, the perfect instrument of their will. But as Lyra stood there with her two dragons, watching the lights of human civilization twinkle in the darkness below, she began to wonder what would happen if she chose to be something else. What would happen if the perfect soldier decided to become imperfect? What would happen if duty could be questioned? If orders could be refused? If there could be more to existence than blind obedience to a system that demanded the destruction of innocent beings? The thought terrified her. The thought also made her feel something that she had never felt before in her entire existence. The thought made her feel alive. Night fell completely over Vexthar, and Lyra remained standing on her cliff, watching the colony below, feeling the weight of the impossible choice that was about to be placed before her. In the morning, she would have to decide. In the morning, the perfect soldier would have to become something new. In the morning, everything would change, but for tonight, she stood with her dragons and simply watched the humans below as they prepared to sleep, completely unaware that their fate rested in the hands of an elven warrior, whose perfect loyalty to the coalition was beginning to crack like old ice in spring. Morning came to Vexthar in the same way it came every day, with a slow increase in the crimson light and a gradual warming of the hostile atmosphere. Lyra had not slept. For 200 years she had mastered the ability to go without rest for extended periods, maintaining peak physical and mental performance through discipline and training. But this night, sleep was impossible even if she had attempted it. She sat beside Ember, her hand resting on the dragon's warm scales, and watched as the colony began to wake. Smoke rose from cooking fires. People emerged from their buildings and began the morning routines of survival on an unforgiving world. A group of what appeared to be teenagers moved toward the agricultural fields with tools designed for cultivating crops in the toxic soil. Older people worked on repairs to the buildings and water collection systems. Everyone had a purpose. Everyone contributed to the survival of the whole. Lyra had spent her entire existence in hierarchical military structures where purpose was assigned and contribution was mandatory. This was different. These humans seemed to choose their work, to find meaning in the struggle itself. They worked not because they had been programmed to obey, but because they understood that their individual efforts contributed to the survival of their community. The communication device on her wrist activated with a sharp electronic chirp. Lyra's hand instinctively moved to answer it, then stopped. She knew what the message would say. Coalition Command checking in, requesting an update, expecting confirmation that the mission would be completed as scheduled. She did not accept the transmission. In all her 200 years of military service, Lyra had never ignored a direct communication from command. The act was unthinkable. The consequences would be catastrophic. And yet she sat there on the cliff, her hand hovering over the communication device, and made the choice to refuse the connection. Ash pressed his head against her shoulder, and the young dragon made a series of small sounds that seemed almost like worry. The dragons had never known their handler to behave this way. They sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the warrior they had followed across 1,000 star systems. Down below, Lyra watched as a group of children were led into the central plaza by adults who appeared to be teachers. The children sat together while an older human male began telling them something, his hands gesturing expressively. Lyra knew that this was probably education, that this human was teaching the next generation knowledge that would help them survive on this brutal world. Among the military structures of the coalition, education was controlled, rigid, designed to produce soldiers and workers. But this seemed different. The children were smiling. Some were asking questions. Some seemed genuinely excited by what they were learning. One of the children was the one she had identified as belonging to Grace, the colony leader. The child had the same red hair, the same way of moving with confidence and purpose. The child asked a question, and the teacher responded with patience and care. The scene was so simple, so ordinary, and yet it struck Lyra with the force of a physical blow. This was what the coalition wanted her to destroy. Not a military threat, not a strategic resource, not even an economic rival. Just humans, just people, just a community of beings trying to build a life in an impossible place. The communication device chirped again, and again, and again. Lyra knew that command was becoming concerned. An elite hunter who refused to respond was unprecedented. Protocol demanded investigation. Protocol demanded retrieval of the asset, or termination if retrieval was not possible. They would send someone. She had perhaps 6 to 8 hours before investigators or enforcement personnel would arrive to determine what had gone wrong with their perfect soldier. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, Lyra felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in her existence, she was making a choice that was not dictated by orders or protocol. For the first time, she was choosing based on what she believed rather than what she had been programmed to believe. Lyra stood and walked down the cliff face with her dragons following close behind. The path was treacherous, but she had studied it thoroughly the previous night. Ember moved with his usual careful grace while Ash bounded ahead with youthful enthusiasm, occasionally sending small rocks tumbling down the slope. As she descended, Lyra made rapid calculations. The humans had primitive weapons, nothing that could seriously threaten her or the dragons. However, they also had something that weapons could not measure. They had experience in this environment. They had knowledge of the terrain, the weather patterns, the resources available. They had survived here for 3 generations through ingenuity and adaptation. These factors would be valuable in the conflict that was coming. The first humans to notice her approach were a group of teenagers working in the fields. They froze, tools falling from their hands, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. An elf woman in military armor, flanked by 2 massive dragons, was not something that fit into their understanding of reality. For a moment, nothing moved except the crimson wind blowing across the barren landscape. Then one of the teenagers turned and ran toward the settlement, shouting a warning that Lyra could hear even at this distance. Within minutes, the entire colony was in chaos. People rushed toward the central plaza, while others moved defensively toward weapons that would be utterly useless against an armored warrior with a plasma rifle. Lyra could have killed them all in the time it took to draw her weapon. She could have completed her mission and been back on the cliff before they even registered that they were under attack. Instead, she stopped at the edge of the settlement and deliberately lowered her weapon, removing her hand from the rifle and holding both hands visible and empty. Grace emerged from the largest building, moving quickly toward the center of the plaza. Behind her came others, armed with tools that had been repurposed as weapons. They formed a protective barrier between their leader and the strange newcomer with the dragons. Lyra raised her hand in the gesture of peaceful approach that transcended species and star systems. She took one careful step forward, then stopped, giving the human space to process her presence and intentions. Grace studied her for a long moment, and in those eyes, Lyra saw intelligence equal to her own. This human leader understood immediately that something was wrong, that an armored warrior with dragons would not approach peacefully if the intention was destruction. Grace's mind was moving rapidly through possibilities, calculating scenarios, trying to understand what had changed. With slow, deliberate movements, Grace moved forward, walking past her own people toward the elf warrior. It was an act of incredible courage. It was also an act of incredible risk, but Grace seemed to understand that this moment would determine everything that followed. When the human leader was close enough to speak without shouting, Lyra said something that she had never said before in her entire existence. She said, "I refuse my orders." Grace's eyes widened slightly, but her expression remained calm. The human leader had clearly not expected such words, but she understood their significance. An elite warrior of the Galactic Coalition did not refuse orders, and if this one was refusing orders, it meant that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of right and wrong. "The Coalition will send more soldiers," Lyra said in simple, careful words. "They will send enforcement personnel to confirm my loyalty. They will likely attempt to destroy the entire colony, to ensure that knowledge of this refusal does not spread. I can help you prepare. I can teach you what they will do. I can give you a chance to survive what is coming." Grace stood silently for a moment, and Lyra could see the calculations happening behind those intelligent human eyes. This could be a trap. This could be some sophisticated method of ensuring compliance. This could end with the destruction of everything the colony had built. But then Grace extended her hand, and she smiled. "You are the alien warrior who came to kill us. But now you guard us instead," Grace said simply. "Welcome to Vexthar. Welcome to the human resistance against the Galactic Coalition. Welcome to a place where you can finally choose your own purpose." Lyra reached out and took the human's hand, and in that moment, she understood that her life as the perfect soldier had ended. Her new life was about to begin, and it would be infinitely more complicated, infinitely more dangerous, and infinitely more meaningful than anything she had known before. The colony's main building had been converted into a war room by the time the sun reached its highest point in the crimson sky. Lyra stood at the center of a large table covered with maps of Vexthar, drawn with impressive accuracy by human hands. Grace stood opposite her, with several other colony leaders arranged around the table. These were the people who had guided the settlement through 3 generations of survival. And now they had to adapt to the reality that the Galactic Coalition had finally discovered their existence and sent an executioner. Lyra traced her finger along the map, showing the approach vectors that Coalition enforcement personnel would likely take. There were only a few viable landing sites for the large military vessels that carried enforcement squads. The terrain was too hostile, the atmospheric conditions too extreme. This was actually an advantage for the humans if they could position themselves correctly. "The Coalition will send a squad of approximately 12 to 20 soldiers," Lyra explained, using words that she knew would be clear to the humans around her. "They will have superior weapons, superior armor, and superior training. However, Vexthar itself is your greatest weapon. They do not understand this planet. They do not know the terrain. They do not know when the toxic storms come or where the safe shelter can be found." A man named David asked how long they had to prepare. Lyra checked her communication device, which had stopped trying to reach her several hours ago. Command would be sending investigators within the next few hours, probably no more than 8. The investigation would take time, at least a few days, before they would be convinced that she had genuinely defected. Then they would prepare a response team, assemble weapons, and coordinate transportation. By her calculation, they had approximately 4 to 5 days before the first major assault would arrive. 4 to 5 days was not much time, but it was enough if they used it wisely. Lyra divided the colony's adult population into teams. Some would be responsible for defense positions, preparing weapons and creating obstacles that would slow the coalition soldiers. Others would focus on evacuation routes, creating hidden paths where the children and elderly could be moved to safety if the defense failed. A third group would work with Lyra to prepare a strategy that used the planet's hostile environment as a weapon. Grace showed the elf warrior the colony's records of weather patterns and discovered that a major toxic storm was scheduled to arrive in approximately 6 days. The storm would be catastrophic for anyone caught in it without proper shelter, but if coalition soldiers arrived during the storm, they would be forced to abandon their assault and seek shelter themselves. Lyra began calculating timing and scenarios, trying to determine if it would be possible to force a coalition engagement during the storm conditions. Throughout the afternoon and evening, humans worked alongside the elf warrior and her dragons. Ember and ash proved invaluable for moving heavy materials and creating defensive barriers that would have been impossible for humans to construct. The dragons did not understand the concept of war or defense, but they understood Lyra's intentions, and they responded to her commands with perfect obedience. Young people were trained in basic combat, learning how to use the simple weapons that the colony had constructed over the years. An older human named Samuel, who had served in military forces on his original homeworld before coming to Vexthar, worked with Lyra to translate coalition tactics into strategies that humans could execute effectively. They discussed ambush tactics using terrain to maximum advantage, and how to maximize damage while minimizing human casualties. As night fell again, Lyra found herself standing alone on the edge of the settlement with Grace. The human leader carried 2 cups of hot liquid that Lyra was learning was called tea. The drink was warm and slightly bitter, and it was one of the few luxuries that the colony had managed to create in their harsh environment. "Why did you really refuse your orders?" Grace asked quietly. The woman was intelligent enough to understand that such a decision could not have been made only because of one night of observation. There had to be something deeper, something more fundamental that had changed in the warrior's understanding of the universe. Lyra considered the question carefully. She had not allowed herself to examine her own motivations too closely, fearing that such examination might lead to doubts and uncertainty. But now, standing with Grace and looking out at the stars above Vexthar, she felt she owed the human leader an honest answer. "In 200 years I have killed thousands of beings," Lyra said slowly. "I did not see them as people. I saw them as obstacles to overcome, problems to solve, missions to complete. But when I saw your colony, when I watched your people work together and care for each other, I began to understand something that the coalition had worked very hard to make me unable to understand. I began to see that the beings I was ordered to kill were not problems or obstacles. They were people. People with hopes and dreams and love for each other." Lyra paused and took a sip of the tea before continuing. "The coalition took me from my mother when I was too young to remember her face. They trained me to view emotions as weakness. They told me that obedience was virtue and questioning was sin. For 200 years I accepted this worldview because I had no other. But you gave me something different. You gave me an example of what humans could be, without the constraints of military conditioning. You showed me that there was an alternative." Grace listened without interrupting, and Lyra found herself continuing, revealing more of her internal thoughts than she had shared with anyone in her entire existence. "I realized that I did not want to be a perfect soldier anymore. I realized that I wanted to choose my own purpose. I wanted to protect something instead of destroying it. I wanted to be part of a community instead of serving a faceless hierarchy. I wanted to know what it meant to be alive instead of simply existing as a weapon." Grace placed her hand on Lyra's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more than words could express. In human culture, this was called friendship. This was called connection. This was called understanding that existed between beings who had chosen to trust each other, despite all the reasons to do otherwise. "The children will be scared tomorrow," Grace said. "They will not understand why the colony must change, why they cannot go to the fields or play freely. Can you speak to them? Can you help them understand why we are preparing for war?" Lyra was surprised by the request, but she understood its significance. The humans needed to see that the elf warrior was not just a military asset. They needed to see that she understood their culture, their values, their commitment to protecting the next generation. By speaking to the children, Lyra would be taking a step toward becoming part of the community rather than just a military strategist. The next morning, the children of the colony gathered in the central plaza. Lyra sat down so that she was closer to their eye level, and she began to tell them a story. She told them about her dragons, about how Ember and Ash had been born from eggs that came from the most dangerous place in the galaxy. She told them that the dragons were small and helpless at first, but they had learned and grown strong because they had a community of people who cared for them and protected them. She told them that now it was time for them to grow strong and protect the colony, not with weapons but with courage and by helping the adults prepare for what was coming. The children listened with wide eyes, and she could see the understanding beginning to form in their minds. They understood that the colony was a family, and families protected each other. They understood that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to act despite the fear. By the time Lyra had finished her story, the children seemed less frightened. They understood that something difficult was coming, but they also understood that their community would face it together, and somehow, the presence of an alien warrior with 2 massive dragons made the future seem less terrifying and more manageable. 5 days passed with incredible speed. 5 days of training, of preparation, of transforming a peaceful agricultural colony into a defensive position. 5 days of Lyra teaching human fighters how to anticipate coalition tactics, how to use the environment to their advantage, how to think like warriors instead of farmers. The toxic storm had arrived as predicted, bringing winds so violent that they could strip skin from bone and rain so acidic that it would dissolve exposed flesh. The colony had moved into the underground shelters that had been created when the settlement was first established. The humans moved through their protective gear with practiced ease, having lived with the threat of toxic storms their entire lives. Lyra watched them and marveled at their adaptation. In just 5 days, she had come to appreciate the remarkable capability of humans to learn quickly when they understood that survival depended on it. The coalition enforcement vessel appeared on the horizon, just as the storm was beginning to ease. Lyra watched from her observation position with Ember beside her, tracking the approach of the massive military transport ship. Behind her, Grace stood at the command position in the underground communication center that the humans had established, coordinating the defense efforts. From the transport vessel, 8 soldiers would descend in rapid descent pods. These soldiers had been chosen for their combat efficiency and their loyalty to the coalition's mission of expansion and control. They were equipped with the latest weapons, armor that could withstand direct fire from most conventional weaponry, and tactical training that made them lethal combatants. Under normal circumstances, 8 coalition soldiers could eliminate a colony of 300 humans without suffering significant casualties, but Vexthar was not normal circumstances. The first descent pod landed near the colony's outer perimeter, exactly where Lyra had predicted it would land. 3 soldiers emerged, moving with the mechanical precision of trained warriors. They began scanning the settlement, searching for movement, searching for targets. Behind them, a second pod landed approximately 200 meters away. Disgorging 3 more soldiers, Lyra gave the signal. The ground beneath the coalition soldiers suddenly became treacherous as humans hidden in prepared positions activated collapse points that had been carefully constructed. 2 soldiers fell into a 12-meter pit that had been hidden beneath camouflage netting. The remaining soldiers scrambled for cover and immediately began returning fire, sending plasma rounds toward the buildings of the colony. But there were no humans in those buildings. Grace had evacuated all non-combatants into the deep shelters. The buildings were empty except for carefully placed obstacles that the soldiers would waste time and ammunition destroying. More soldiers descended in additional pods, until all 8 coalition warriors were on the ground. They quickly adapted to the ambush, moving toward protective positions and establishing a defensive perimeter. Lyra had expected this. Coalition soldiers were trained to respond to unexpected situations, and they would quickly overcome the initial shock of the colony's resistance. Ember took flight on Lyra's command, circling above the coalition position. The dragon was not armed, but his presence was intimidating, and it forced the soldiers to keep their weapons divided between multiple threats. Several of them fired upward at the dragon, but Ember's scales were too tough and the distance too great for their weapons to cause significant damage. The human fighters emerged from their positions, moving according to the battle plan that had been rehearsed countless times over the previous 5 days. They did not try to face the coalition soldiers in direct combat, because they understood that they would lose such an engagement. Instead, They used coordinated strikes, attacking from multiple directions to confuse and divide the enemy forces. Samuel led a team that had been assigned to target the coalition soldiers' equipment. The soldiers' armor was sophisticated, but the joints and connections had specific vulnerable points. Lyra had spent hours teaching the human fighters exactly where to strike to compromise armor integrity. An attack on the right shoulder joint could disable the weapon system. An attack on the leg joint could impair mobility. The humans were not trying to kill the soldiers. They were trying to neutralize them. The battle lasted for 40 minutes, but it felt like hours compressed into moments. The coalition soldiers were skilled and dangerous, but they were also operating in an environment where every advantage had been stripped away from them. The toxic atmosphere, the difficult terrain, the coordinated resistance of a community fighting for survival, all combined to put them in a position they had never experienced before. The first coalition soldier fell to a coordinated strike that targeted an armor weakness while simultaneously disrupting his weapon system with electromagnetic pulses that Lyra had taught the humans to create using crude technology salvaged from the colony's salvage operations. The soldier collapsed, his armor suddenly without power, and the humans moved past him toward the next target. Ash joined the battle next to Ember, using his smaller size and greater agility to harry the coalition soldiers and disrupt their coordinated formations. The dragons did not kill, but they forced the soldiers into positions where the humans could attack. The bond between Lyra and her dragons had created a perfect synthesis of coordinated tactics. Lyra herself moved through the battlefield with terrible efficiency, her years of military training making her a devastation unto herself. She did not try to engage the coalition soldiers directly, knowing that such one-on-one combat would be catastrophic for her new community. Instead, she worked to protect the human fighters, intercepting enemy fire and using her superior speed and strength to position the soldiers into kill zones that had been prepared in advance. Grace watched everything from the communication center, coordinating the human movements, shifting resources where they were most needed, calling for retreat when a position became too dangerous. The human leader had shown remarkable aptitude for military strategy, suggesting that her people had understood for a long time that conflict might one day come. By the time the battle ended, 5 coalition soldiers had been taken alive, their armor disabled and their weapons removed. 2 soldiers had been killed in combat, which gave Lyra a deep sense of regret that surprised her. 3 soldiers had managed to reach their descent pod and had initiated an emergency ascent sequence that would carry them back to the transport vessel. They had failed in their mission. The colony had won. Not decisively, Lyra understood. The coalition would send a larger force. The coalition would escalate its tactics. But this first engagement had proven that humans could stand against the Galactic Coalition's military might and survive. This first engagement had shown that organized resistance was possible. As the dust settled and the colony's medical personnel began treating the wounded, Grace emerged from the underground shelter and stood beside Lyra. The human leader looked exhausted, but her eyes held fierce pride. "We did it," Grace said simply. "The impossible. We stood against the Galactic Coalition and we survived. What happens now?" Lyra watched as the sun set over Vexithar, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. She thought about what would come next. She thought about the larger forces that would be sent. She thought about the possibility of failure and the possibility of victory, but mostly she thought about how she had finally found something worth fighting for. And she thought that perhaps that was the most important victory of all. 3 weeks passed after the first battle, and the colony transformed into something that resembled a military fortress more than a settlement. The humans had worked around the clock, reinforcing defenses, creating additional shelter systems, and continuing their training with Lyra. The elf warrior had become the heart of their resistance, and her presence had shifted from that of an outsider to that of a true community member. But Lyra knew that the coalition would not accept defeat easily. In her 200 years of military service, she had never seen the Galactic Coalition back away from any challenge to their authority. They would escalate. They would send more soldiers, more weapons, more firepower, and eventually they would attempt to completely obliterate the colony and everyone in it. The message came through on a salvaged coalition communication frequency that the humans had managed to intercept. Lyra listened to the encrypted transmission and her blood ran cold. The coalition was sending an entire invasion force, not just enforcement personnel but military troops, support vessels, and weapons platforms. This was no longer a simple execution of an unauthorized settlement. This was now a full military operation, designed to make an example of any world that harbored resistance to coalition authority. She gathered Grace and the colony leaders in the war room. The news brought them to a silence that seemed to stretch forever. They had proven that they could win against a single enforcement squad. But an invasion force? An entire fleet of military vessels? Lyra studied their faces and saw fear there. But she also saw something else. She saw determination. She saw the refusal to surrender despite knowing that surrender might be the only option that would save lives. These humans had chosen to fight for their freedom, and they had decided that they would continue fighting no matter what came next. "I have been sending communications to other worlds," Lyra announced. "Worlds where there are humans, where there are other species that have been oppressed by the Galactic Coalition. I have told them about your colony. I have told them about how you stood against the Coalition and survived. Some of them have responded. They want to help. They want to fight." Grace stepped forward, her red hair catching the light from the emergency lamps that illuminated the war room. "You have been planning this since the first day," she said. "You have been building more than just a defense for our colony. You have been creating the foundation for something larger, a rebellion." Lyra did not respond immediately. She had always been careful about expressing her true intentions, fearing that it might sound too ambitious, too revolutionary, too dangerous to voice aloud. But now she could see that Grace already understood what was happening. "The Galactic Coalition is not as strong as it appears," Lyra said. "Their power comes from the assumption that resistance is impossible, that their military dominance is overwhelming, that any world that challenges them will be destroyed. But that assumption is fragile. If one colony can survive, if one community can stand against them and not be immediately annihilated, it changes the entire calculation. It shows that the coalition can be resisted." David asked how long they had before the invasion force arrived. Lyra's calculation suggested approximately 10 days. 10 days to prepare for an assault that would involve hundreds of soldiers and weapons platforms that could level entire sections of the colony in seconds. 10 days to transform a group of farmers and miners into warriors capable of fighting against impossible odds, but something unexpected happened on the 7th day. The first ships to arrive above Vexthar were not coalition vessels. They were merchant vessels, salvage operations, and military ships from smaller independent factions that had been inspired by Lyra's communications. They had risked their own safety to come to Vexthar and offer their support. Some brought weapons. Some brought experienced military personnel. Some brought medical supplies and reinforcements that would help the colony withstand the coming assault. More ships arrived over the following 2 days. Humans from other colonies, aliens from oppressed species, even some former coalition soldiers who had become disillusioned with their military's practices. A movement had begun that would change the political landscape of the entire region of space. The coalition invasion force arrived on the 10th day, and when they entered the Vexthar system, they encountered something they had not expected. They encountered a united resistance. They encountered multiple armed vessels, coordinated defensive positions, and the very thing that the Galactic Coalition feared most above all else. They encountered the proof that they could be opposed. The battle for Vexthar became legendary across the galaxy. It would later be called the Battle of the First Resistance, the moment when the crushing dominance of the Galactic Coalition was first seriously challenged. The Coalition's invasion force suffered significant casualties. Their weapons platforms were destroyed by coordinated strikes. Their military operations were disrupted by resistance fighters who understood the terrain and had the motivation of fighting for their own survival. And in the middle of the chaos and violence, Lyra fought alongside her dragons and her human companions, no longer as a soldier serving an abstract authority, but as a warrior fighting for something she had chosen to believe in. The Coalition did not win on Vexthar. They did not lose completely, but they did not achieve their objective of eliminating the colony and suppressing the resistance. They were forced to withdraw, to regroup, to acknowledge that the challenge to their authority was more serious than they had initially assumed. When the battle ended and the smoke cleared, Lyra stood on the cliff overlooking the colony with Grace beside her. The settlement had been damaged, but it was not destroyed. The humans had survived, which meant that hope had survived, which meant that the impossible had become possible. Grace placed her arm around Lyra, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks ago. An elf warrior and a human leader standing together, having chosen to be more than enemies, having chosen to be allies, friends, partners in a struggle that would define the future of their entire region of space. "What happens now?" Lyra said quietly. "The Coalition will return. They will not accept this defeat easily." "I know," Grace answered, "but this time we will not face them alone. This time, we will face them with allies who believe in what we are fighting for, and that makes all the difference." Lyra looked down at the colony where humans worked to rebuild what had been damaged. Children emerged from shelters and played in the open air, celebrating survival. Adults tended to the wounded and helped restore the structures that had been damaged by weapons fire. She thought about her 200 years in the Galactic Coalition. She thought about all the missions she had completed, all the orders she had followed, all the beings she had killed because she had been programmed to believe that obedience was the highest virtue, and she realized that none of that had been living. All of that had been simply existing as a weapon, as a tool, as an instrument of someone else's will. This was different. This was life. This was choosing to risk everything for something she believed in. This was choosing to stand with a community, rather than stand apart as a weapon of destruction. Ember and Ash emerged from the colony and climbed up to the cliff where their handler stood with her human companion. The dragons had changed over the course of these weeks. They had learned that their strength could be used to protect rather than only to dominate. They had learned that there was purpose in defense, that there was honor in fighting for something greater than themselves. Lyra reached down and touched both dragons, feeling their warmth, feeling the connection that had grown deeper through the trials they had faced together. The future would bring more battles. The future would bring more challenges, more difficulty, more conflict with the Galactic Coalition. But standing there on that cliff with Grace and her dragons, surrounded by the human colony that had learned to survive the impossible, Lyra understood that they would face whatever came together, because she had finally learned the most important lesson that the Coalition had spent 200 years trying to teach her could never be taught. She had learned that true strength came not from obedience but from choice. True strength came not from dominance but from connection. True strength came from finding something worth fighting for and having the courage to fight for it. The alien warrior had come to Vexthar to destroy. But in destroying her old life and choosing a new one, she had become something more important than a soldier. She had become a guardian, a protector, a friend. She had become free.